The envelope was yellowed, the edges curled as if aged by time itself. No return address, no stamp, just a name scrawled in trembling black ink. Isabel Holloway. Isabel had been dead for 6 months. Mark Holloway, her grieving husband, stood in the dim glow of his kitchen, staring at the envelope as a chill coiled around his spine. The house had been silent since her passing, an eerie void where laughter once echoed. Now, the silence seemed to throb, pressing against his eardrums, whispering unseen things. His fingers trembled as he opened it. Inside a single sheet of paper, the ink was smudged, as if written in haste or with shaking hands. "Mark, my love, I don't have much time. The thing in the walls is watching." It never left. Mark's breath hitched. His eyes darted toward the walls of the old house. The wallpaper, faded roses on ivory, seemed to pulse, shifting in the dim light. The house had been in his family for generations, filled with creaks and whispers that he'd always blamed on old pipes and settling wood. But Isabel had always feared something deeper. She used to wake up screaming, swearing she heard scratching inside the walls. "Something's in there," she'd whisper, her voice quivering. "Something alive." Mark had laughed it off. But now, his dead wife had written him a warning. He read the letter again, and that's when he noticed it. The ink at the bottom wasn't just smeared. It was smudged as if something had dragged their fingers through the wet ink. And beneath the last sentence, pressed into the paper like it had been carved in with a fingernail, was a single word: "Run." A soft scratching noise echoed from inside the walls. Mark's breath came in short gasps. The air turned thick, suffocating. He stepped backward, his socks dragging against the cold wooden floor. Then from inside the wall something knocked. Once, twice, a slow, deliberate rhythm. And then, a voice. Her voice. "Mark." The letter slipped from his fingers. Isabel was dead. He had buried her. He had seen her body, pale and lifeless inside the casket. But that voice, it was unmistakable. "Mark, let me out." A deep, suffocating cold coiled around his chest. His stomach lurched, because the voice wasn't coming from the front door. It wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from inside the wall. Mark stood frozen. His ears rang, his pulse pounded, and his legs felt cemented to the floor. "Mark, let me out." His wife's voice. Soft, weak, desperate. But Isabel was dead. He had watched as the coffin was lowered into the cold earth. He had thrown the first handful of dirt onto the polished wood. He had seen her body. This isn't real. His mind screamed for logic, for rationality, but his body refused to listen. His gaze snapped to the wall where the voice had come from. The faded wallpaper seemed stretched, distorted, like something was pressing against it from the other side. The knock came again. Slow, deliberate, closer. Is this a hallucination? His grief had been unbearable, and there were nights when he swore he heard her breathing beside him, felt the bed shift under her weight. But this was real. Swallowing dry air, he took a hesitant step forward. His fingers reached for the wall, trembling when, thump, a violent slam rattled the entire structure. He stumbled back, knocking over a chair. The kitchen light flickered, buzzing angrily, and then silence. A silence so thick it pressed into his ears, suffocating, unnatural. And then, just as he thought it had stopped, the whisper. "Please, Mark, it's so dark in here." A cold sweat dripped down his back. His breath came in shallow gasps. He had to get out of this house. Without thinking, he turned and bolted toward the front door. His bare feet slapped against the hardwood floor as he fumbled with the lock. His hands were slick with sweat, shaking uncontrollably. He twisted the knob and yanked the door open. Slam! It shut by itself. Hard! The force sent him staggering back, his chest rising and falling in ragged panic. He grabbed the knob again and twisted. It wouldn't budge. No! His house had never had locks that jammed. A gust of wind blew through the hallway, carrying the scent of rot, decayed flowers, damp earth, and something metallic. Something foul. The letter. It was still lying on the floor where he had dropped it. But something was different. The ink had changed. The letters were bleeding, shifting, as if something unseen was writing more words in the same trembling script. "Mark, it knows you're here. It won't let you leave. Don't let it in." His stomach turned violently. From inside the wall, the sound of nails raking against the wood filled the air. Long, slow, scratching sounds like an animal trying to dig its way out. Then, a new voice. Low. Wrong. It didn't sound like Isabel anymore. "Mark, open the door." His breath caught in his throat. "I miss you, my love." The voice was smiling. It wasn't her. Whatever was inside the wall, it was never her. Tears burned at the corners of his eyes. His mind raced for answers, for logic, but what logic was there in the dead speaking from behind his walls? He stumbled back, knocking into the table. The candle on the counter flickered wildly, as if disturbed by a gust of breath. Then the wall shifted. A bulge pressed outward, stretching the wallpaper grotesquely, as if something was pushing from the other side. A handprint, pale fingers pressed against the wall from within. Then another, then another. Dozens of hands, pale skeletal writhing. The wall split with a sickening tear, revealing a gaping wound of darkness. A void, a tunnel that led into nothingness. And from that nothingness, something stepped forward, something wearing her skin. It looked like Isabel, but the head tilted too far to the side. The mouth stretched too wide when it smiled, the fingers too long, and the eyes were wrong. Empty, hollow, hungry. Mark couldn't move, couldn't scream. The thing in the walls opened its mouth too wide, too deep, too dark. "You let me in, Mark." It reached for him, and the candle went out. Mark's world was swallowed by darkness. A thick, unnatural blackness poured from the gaping wound in the wall, smothering the dim kitchen light. The air turned suffocating, thick with the scent of rot, damp wood, and something sickly sweet, like spoiled fruit. And in that darkness, it moved. The thing that looked like Isabel took a step forward. Its bare feet didn't make a sound as they touched the floor. Mark tried to run, but his legs refused to obey. His body had turned to stone, frozen by a terror so raw it made his stomach churn. His mind screamed at him to move, to do something, but his limbs remained locked in place. And the thing had just stood there, watching, a grotesque mockery of his wife. Its mouth stretched too wide in a smile that was all wrong, its lips peeling back, revealing teeth that were too many, too sharp, too deep. Then, in a voice that almost sounded like her, "You let me in, Mark." It lurched toward him. That was enough to shatter his paralysis. With a strangled gasp, he stumbled backward so hard he crashed into the kitchen counter, sending a glass shattering onto the floor. The noise rang through the house like a gunshot. The thing stopped, tilted its head. The surrounding darkness shifted, writhing like smoke. Then, a whisper from the wall. "Don't look at it, Mark." His blood turned to ice. The voice was soft, weak, and this time, it really was Isabel's. His chest clenched. His heart pounded violently against his ribs. "Isabel," he choked out. Silence. The thing that wore her skin didn't move, didn't breathe. It stood unnaturally still, the wide grin frozen on its face. And then, "Mark!" The voice was behind him, directly behind him. A hand gripped his shoulder. Cold, clammy. "Wrong!" Mark screamed and whipped around, shoving himself away. His back slammed against the kitchen table, knocking over a chair. His breathing was ragged, his pulse thundering in his ears. Nothing was there, but the touch had been real, too real. The darkness shifted again, and suddenly the entire house exhaled. The walls creaked and groaned, the wooden beams stretching like old, brittle bones. The floorboards beneath his feet trembled. The wallpaper, once old and faded, peeled away in strips, curling like burnt paper. The kitchen light flickered violently, buzzing like a swarm of angry insects. Mark ran. He lunged for the front door, his fingers scrambling against the lock. He twisted the knob again and again. It wouldn't move. Behind him, the sound of bare feet dragging across the floor. Slow, purposeful, closer. Mark's hands shook as he grabbed the deadbolt, and yanked. It snapped off in his grip, his breath caught in his throat. And then, the whisper. "Mark, behind you." His entire body went rigid. He could feel it. Something loomed over him. Too close. Close enough that he could feel the air shift behind him, like something was waiting. A single breath, not his own, brushed against the back of his neck. Slow, shuddering. The smell of rot invaded his nose. And then, a hand slid through his hair. Long, thin. Fingers. Mark spun around, swinging wildly. Nothing. 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 But the air was thick, almost suffocating. The house wasn't just dark anymore. It was changing. The walls were pulsing. The kitchen floor felt soft beneath his feet, like rotting wood soaked with water. The furniture was shifting, twisting, melting into grotesque, unrecognizable shapes. Something was very, very wrong. And then, the letter. It was on the floor where he had dropped it. Only now, the words had changed again. "Mark, it won't let you leave. You can't trust your eyes. You can't trust your ears. You can't trust me." His stomach lurched. The house shuddered. The walls began to bleed. Thick, black ichors seeped from the cracks, oozing down like tar, pulling at his feet. And then, from somewhere inside the house, a sound. A low, gurgling laugh. It wasn't Isabel. It wasn't human. It was hungry. Mark turned toward the hallway. The shadows had shifted, and standing there at the end of the dark corridor was... No. It was him, a perfect, identical copy of himself. The same messy hair, the same wide, terrified eyes. The other Mark smiled, and in his hand, a knife. The candle in the kitchen flickered one last time. Then, darkness, and the house swallowed him whole. The darkness was alive. It wrapped around Mark like suffocating hands, pressing into his skin, worming into his ears, filling his mouth with the sickening taste of rot. His heartbeat pounded like a drum inside his skull. His lungs burned, but no matter how much he tried to move, he couldn't. He wasn't paralyzed. No, that would have been a mercy. This was something worse. Something was holding him still. He could feel it. The pressure of invisible fingers curled around his wrists. Something cold, something thin, something with too many joints and too much strength. It knew he wanted to run. It knew he wanted to scream. And it was savoring the moment. Then, a whisper in the dark. Not Isabel's voice. Not the thing in the walls. No, the other him. "Why are you running, Mark?" The voice was his. Exactly his. It wasn't just mimicking him. It sounded like it came from inside his own head, like his own thoughts had turned against him. Mark's breath hitched. His entire body trembled. Somewhere, a match struck to life. A small flickering glow bloomed in the darkness, illuminating a hand, his hand holding the tiny flame. And then the light grew. The shadows peeled back just enough for Mark to see. He was no longer in his kitchen. The walls had melted away, leaving only endless black corridors stretching in all directions. The floor beneath him was warped, wrong, covered in something that looked like old, rotting wood. But when he shifted his feet, it squished like flesh. And standing a few feet away, holding the match, himself, the other Mark, he looked identical down to the last detail. Same clothes, same scars, same terrified expression. But there was something wrong with his eyes. They weren't human. "You should have opened the door, Mark." The flame flickered, and for a single, horrifying second, Mark saw what was really standing there. The skin wasn't skin. It was stretched too tight, like an ill-fitting suit. The lips weren't lips. They were painted on, cracked at the edges, peeling to reveal something glistening and wet beneath. And the hands, too long, too thin, too many fingers. Mark's stomach lurched. The match went out. Darkness again, but the voice was still there. "Do you know what's inside the walls, Mark?" A sharp pain sliced through his temples, white-hot and blinding. Images flashed in his mind. The walls of the house. Not made of wood, not made of brick, made of something else, something alive, something waiting. Mark screamed, and suddenly, he was falling. The ground beneath him gave way, and he plummeted through the dark, his stomach twisting, air rushing past his ears. It felt like he was dropping for hours, tumbling through nothing until, Crash. Pain exploded through his body as he hit the floor. But it wasn't what beneath him. It was dirt. Cold. Damp. Heavy. His fingers dug into the earth, the scent of wet soil and decay filling his nose. The darkness still surrounded him, thick and absolute, but he could feel something moving beneath him. A faint noise reached his ears. Scratching. No. Digging. Mark's breath caught in his throat. It was coming from below. Slow. Methodical. Like something was clawing its way up. And then, a whisper, muffled by the dirt beneath him. "Mark, let me out." "Isabel." Mark scrambled backward, his hands sinking into the damp soil. His breath came in panic gasps. And then, right in front of him, a hand burst through the dirt. Pale. Thin. Fingers curling and twisting, nails blackened and cracked. Another hand followed, then an arm, then a face. Mark choked on his own scream. It was Isabel, or what was left of her. Her skin was pale, too pale, stretched tight over bone. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, pupils dilated into black pits. Her mouth opened too wide, a low gurgling sound escaping her throat. "You buried me, Mark?" Tears burned in his eyes. "No," he whispered. "No, But I never left." A hand gripped his ankle. Cold. So cold. Then, she pulled. The ground split apart beneath him. Mark thrashed, kicking wildly, but the earth swallowed him whole. The house was never haunted. The house was never real. The thing inside the walls was never inside the walls. It was inside him. And then, just before the soil closed over his head, he heard it again. The voice from the letter. A whisper, soft, cruel, knowing. Run, but it was already too late. Mark's world was buried. The cold, damp earth collapsed around him, crushing his chest, filling his mouth, pressing into his eyes. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The weight of the soil smothered him, tightening like a coffin made of flesh and decay. And in that choking darkness, Isabel's hands never let go. Her grip was iron, unrelenting. She was dragging him deeper. Mark's mind screamed. His lungs burned. His fingers clawed at the dirt. But the more he struggled, the faster he sank. And then, just as his body gave in, he fell through. The weight vanished. The earth split open beneath him, and he plummeted into emptiness. Not just darkness, a place that should not exist. He landed hard on something soft. Not earth, not stone, something that breathed beneath him. Mark's eyes shot open, and he saw a vast, endless space stretched around him, a cathedral of pulsing flesh, twisting walls that weren't walls at all. They were veins, arteries, muscle. He was inside something living, and he was not alone. The whisper returned, curling around his ears like a lover's breath. "You should have let me in, Mark." He turned too fast, his vision blurred as reality twisted. The surrounding space moved, shifted, right. And there, standing in front of him, was Isabel. But not Isabel. Her form was collapsing, flickering between what she was and what she had become. One moment, she was the woman he had loved. Asterisk soft hair, trembling lips, desperate eyes. The next, her flesh melted into something wrong. Her eyes hollowed out, her jaw unhinged, her fingers lengthened into writhing black tendrils. Mark stumbled backward. "No," he gasped. No, this isn't." She took a step forward. The ground beneath them pulsed. "You brought us here, Mark?" Her voice shifted, doubled, tripled. It wasn't just her speaking anymore. It was dozens, hundreds, from the walls, the floor, the air itself. The thing inside the walls was never in the walls. It had always been in him. Mark's breathing turned ragged. He clutched his chest. Something inside him was moving, something waiting to be let out. His fingers trembled as he looked down, and he saw the truth. His stomach was splitting open. A single, blackened hand clawed its way out of his own skin. Then another, then a face. His own. The other Mark was inside him, and now it was escaping. Mark screamed. The pain was beyond agony. His ribs cracked, his skin tore, his body was no longer his. The other Mark smiled. "You should have opened the door, Mark." And then, Everything ripped apart. The house stood silent. Empty. Forgotten. Rotting. The neighborhood had changed. Most of the neighbors had moved away. Some claimed it was because of the economy. Others because of the smell. No one had entered the house since Mark disappeared. Until tonight. A car pulled up to the curb. A man stepped out, stretching his legs after the long drive. He glanced up at the old, abandoned home, his brow furrowing. Damn thing looks worse than I remember. He pulled out his phone and checked the listing again. A fixer-upper for a great price. It was practically a steal. A cold wind rushed through the street. The man shivered. Shoving his hands into his pockets, he grabbed the house keys. Then he walked up the steps. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. From deep within the walls, something knocked.